Evening. That was wimpy. Evening. Yeah, that's great. So thanks. Really happy to be back and talk about this topic. So try to do just a little bit of review. These are same slides as last time. So this is the overview of this week, last week, this week, and next week. So introduction, background issues, and then the evidence. And we got into the evidence. So introduction was actually, remember, we talked a little bit about words and language and how that functions, and that the difference between sense and reference. Sense is what you're saying. Reference is what you're saying it about. And we often think that words have only one meaning and that it's solid across all cultures at all times, and that just is not the case. The example, I'm mad about my flat, and if you're an American, it means one thing. If you live in London, it means something totally different. The sense is different, what you're saying, and the reference is different, what you're saying it about. And so, and then also an awareness that connotation and denotation, we get those mixed up. Denotation is dictionary definition, but connotation is related meanings. And because we are not always thinking, in fact, we're rarely thinking so critically when we speak or read or listen, but we can misconstrue if we're not careful. So I use the example of source and origin. And we think those two are really pretty close, right? Source and origin, they're pretty close. Is the source of a river the same as the origin of a river? Yep, they're pretty close, but the source of a news story and the origin of a news story really quite far apart. And so a lot of confusion happens if we're not paying careful attention to those kind of distinctions. And then we talked about a number of particular passages, and we're now going to just scoot right ahead to another set of passages. So we talked about Genesis a little bit and about the creation of human beings. Adam is the first human created, and that's what Adam means, human. And then Isha, so woman and man are equally part of what it means to be human. That is, woman doesn't come from a guy named Adam. Woman comes from, and so does man come from, this generic idea of what it means to be human. And then we also talked about headship, and that we think head, because in our culture it often means the person who's in charge. But we can use head in ways that aren't about superiority or about being in charge. We could say, I think I used the example of Luciano Pavarotti when he was alive, was a leading tenor, but he wasn't the boss of all tenors everywhere. So we think of head meaning in charge because of the places where it does mean that, and we uncritically use that or bring those connotations in to whenever we see head. Then I tried to point out that in contemporary culture, in the first century, head was almost never used for superiority, just because we use it that way. So if Paul was using it that way, then he's speaking in a way that, if all that is true, he's speaking in a way that then would not convey his point to the people listening to him. Does that make sense? So I'm not saying headship doesn't have anything to do with authority, but I'm saying we need to ask about the character of that authority. Plato said that the center is the heart. That's what really runs the show, not the mind, not knowledge. So now we're going to talk about a number of passages that have to do with speaking, silence, leadership, teaching. So this is a pretty well-known one. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It's the same as having her head shaved. So head coverings. So while the passage is concerned with head coverings, it should not be missed that the text assumes that women can prophesy, pray and prophesy. And that word prophesy in Greek, if you look it up in a lexicon, one of the definitions is going to be to preach, meaning to speak God's word. So the term is broader than to deliver some sort of oracle. The only question in the text is of the attire of the woman discussed. So women can pray and prophesy. They just need to do it with their heads covered. And that's why in a lot of churches you see women wearing some kind of head covering, hats or whatever, to church every Sunday. So what's kind of behind that? In the ancient world, in the ancient Mediterranean, no matter where you went, whether it was Libya, whether it was Spain, whether it was Italy, whether it was Greece, whether it was the Middle East, women went about in public with their heads covered. And just like today in the Middle East, like the burqa is maybe the most extreme iteration of that. So everywhere you went, women went about in public with their heads covered. In Italy, that was the least extravagant head covering, and there are some historical reasons for that. During the Second Punic War, so there were 3 Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage. The Second Punic War is the one where Hannibal crossed the Alps and spent 20 years rampaging up and down Italy, and they never defeated him. Their whole battle strategy was defensive. A defensive strategy, never engage in a pitched battle where everything would be decided. But what happened was something like 70 to 80,000 or more Roman men of marriageable age were killed in that battle in those 20 years. And so all sorts of wives and all sorts of wives were widowed. And so they actually had to change the constitution so that women could marry with or without manus, that's Latin for hand. So that's the only culture we know of in the ancient world, ancient Mediterranean, where women could inherit. They could get married and still have control over their family fortune, because there often were no young men left to inherit. So am I making sense here? So they would wear the least elaborate head coverings. But the idea was, if you were a woman, wherever you went in the ancient world, Mediterranean world, you went out in public with your heads covered. But around 20 AD, about 30, 40 years before Paul was writing this, the wife and daughters of the emperor began going about in public without their heads covered. And that was a way of expressing just supreme social influence. So I lived in did I tell you my Dennis Rodman story? Did I tell you that story? It's okay. I'm very excited I didn't. So I lived in Chicago for 20 years or 12 years, and that was while the Bulls were winning championships. And Dennis Rodman, the famous, really colorful power forward. So they won the championship, and the next morning there was a newspaper story about Dennis Rodman, who after the game went home, put on a wedding dress, white shoes, high heel shoes, size 27 or something, and got on his motorcycle and rode downtown, and the newspaper article said, "What an interesting guy." So I got inspired. I thought, I'd like to be an interesting guy too. So I showed up at my Christian college to teach New Testament, and I was wearing a wedding dress. No, I wasn't doing that, because he could get away with it. But if I did that the next day, I wouldn't be working there anymore, right? So that one of the rules is the powerful get to break the rules. And so the idea here is, if you are going to speak in church, don't you dare make it about yourself. Does that make sense? So he doesn't say women can't pray and prophesy. He says when they pray and prophesy, they're supposed to do it with their heads covered. Meaning, don't you ever dare make it about you. If you're speaking to God's people and you're speaking, God's word, be very careful not to make it about you, because it's really easy to get confused about that. But it would be read that way by people. If you went about with your head uncovered, they would see you as as making some claim about surpassing social power and authority. Now, the other thing we know sociologically is the early Christian church was understood to be a collegia. So from the Latin college, collegia means a free, independent association. So the ones that are more on our day are like the Seroptimus Club or the Elks Club or something like that. So the idea is most people had absolutely no power at all. Maybe the better example is, did you guys watch the Flintstones? Remember watching the Flintstones? And Fred and Barney belonged to a club, right? The Sacred Order of the Water Buffalo. And they never really do anything there, but they go to this club, and the head of the Sacred Order of the Water Buffalo is the Grand Poobah, right? So there were thousands and thousands of these clubs. The most sacred order of wool washers in the port of Ostia. The holy consistory of linen weavers. So they had these elaborate names, and they didn't have any power, but they gave people an opportunity to feel like they belonged to something, and somebody would get elected the Grand Poobah for the year, and they had a chance to feel a little bit of pride that was attached to them personally. And the other thing I need to say is, pagan religion has nothing to do with faith. It has nothing to do with salvation. Nothing at all. The gods are merely like all-powerful teenagers. You don't look to them for salvation. You don't look to them for as moral exemplars. And pagan worship is, wow, if something goes wrong in your life, you got to figure out which God is angry at you and then placate them. And that can last maybe 50 seconds and you're done. Pour a little wine, put a little barbecue rib on the fire, you're done. So there's no faith there. And so people would join the Christian community thinking it was just another one of these clubs that they could become a powerful person. So that's why Paul even has to say something like this. If you're going to pray and prophesy, you need to do it with your head covered. Because doing with your head uncovered is going to send a social signal. It's about you. Is that making sense? Okay. Yeah, so at first this was a scandal, but it then became popular among the powerful and was understood as a marker of social superiority. And Paul doesn't want any of that in the Christian communities. The gospel was not, and is not a vehicle to make statements intended to promote yourself. And the great Roman historian Ramsay MacMullen is the one who pointed this out 30 or 40 years ago. So if you want to pursue that question a little bit. What about a little later on in 1 Corinthians 11? In verses 5 through 7, Paul uses the word kalypto, meaning cover, often translated veil. Verse 10 says, a woman ought to have a sign of authority on her head, exousia. Morna Hooker, who is retired now, but was the prominent, the most important New Testament scholar at Cambridge University for a long time. She points out that the natural way to translate this passage is that a woman ought to have authority on her head. That is, she has the authority and ought to have that symbol. So the text is not questioning whether a woman could have authority. She does, but how is it properly to be modeled? How is it properly to be exercised? And then there's this. And this is one of these really, there's a lot in Paul that can be confusing. Here's one of them. So when the women pray and prophesy, they should do so with their heads covered. And then he says, nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as the woman came from man, so also man is born of woman. But everything comes from God. So that's really interesting. First he says women ought to wear head coverings where men don't necessarily have to. But then he says, in the Lord, however. Okay, if this part is in the Lord, then what's the other part? What's the other part in? So I think you can see that Paul here is aware of social dynamics. In the Lord, there's no distinction, right? He's just like Galatians. In Christ there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. But in culture in the world, those distinctions do exist. So how do we preserve the theology of in Christ there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, as we seek to not just be in the world, but be Christ's agents of reconciliation to that world? Is that making sense? So that's how I read all this. Now, there are other New Testament scholars who don't want to read it that way or don't read it that way. They just read it sort of flat. But I understand Paul as somebody who understands the culture and understands his message and says, how can I best communicate this message to a culture that has a very different symbol system? So that's my confession about, in case you haven't figured out yet, that's my confession about how I approach this. I don't think it's flat. I think Paul is a nuanced thinker, and he's aware of the culture around him, but he's aware of the theology, and then how do I preserve that theology and present it to a culture that doesn't necessarily have that same symbol system. So, 1 Corinthians 14. So now we're a couple chapters later. Let the women keep silent as in all the churches. So this short admonition occurs immediately upon the heels of a series of teachings about order and worship that conclude with Paul writing, "For God is not a God of disorder, but of peace." And immediately after this, Paul writes, "As in all the congregation of the saints, women should remain silent. They are not to speak, but must be in submission as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in church." Now, there are two words that are in play here. Be quiet and be silent. So elsewhere in Paul, he'll say, let the women learn in silence. So that's not shut up. That's they're paying attention. They're learning in submission to the teaching. This word is don't talk. And it's clear from the text that they have questions. And so don't be disrupting the service, the sermon, by asking questions. We think sermons are kind of sacred, right? You know, it's really kind of bad form to just disagree with the pastor, stand up and disagree with the pastor during the sermon. You ever done that at Midtown? Try it next week, just see what happens. But in the ancient world, it was much more it could be much more of a back and forth. We know that we have a lot of the sermons that Augustine preached 400 years later, but the text of the sermon and even discussion of description of what was going on in the congregation. And he's often engaged with people who are shouting cat calls at him, etc. But so Paul is here saying, this isn't really about whether women can speak in church. It's about don't disrupt the service. Does that make sense? Okay. Somehow I have lost the screen. It says, contact us. Can we advance it? Well, I don't know. I can't tell what I'm supposed to touch here. I think no, because we are going to do that at the end. I'd be happy to, but for the sake of the recording, which people are going to be totally interested tomorrow when they watch this, and I'm up here saying I don't know how to make this work. So, Okay, great. Thank you. Am I going the right way? I want to go backwards. Am I going the right way? Well, I just want to keep going backwards. Am I going backwards or forwards? Okay. Okay, we're right about here. Well, yeah, so the options are, is Paul saying women don't pray in public, or instead that they are to dress modestly? Paul expects the reader to understand that women do in fact pray publicly. Is that the right? I don't think that's the right place. Yeah, this is... Yeah, okay. So here it is, right? If they want to inquire about, so it's clear. They're asking a question. So wait, don't disrupt the service by asking questions in the middle of the service. So the broader context concerns disturbances in a meeting. But the word that Paul uses here, sigao, means stop speaking or be silent. It's a different word than he uses elsewhere about being quiet or being calm. So Paul wants the women to be educated, but the point seems to be that the worship experience is not the place for them to be asking questions, as the following point, if they want to inquire about something, indicates. And maybe it's worth pointing out that in Judaism, the women were not supposed to be educated. So there's a serious departure then from Paul's own his own personal experience within Judaism. Okay, this might be the most controversial or contentious passage. 1 Timothy 2, 8 through 15. Therefore I want men everywhere to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or disputing. I also want the women to dress modestly, with decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles or gold pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship God. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. So this is not the same word. This is not be silent. It's be ready to learn. So a woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to bear or assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived. But the woman will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, holiness, and propriety. So this is an enormously complicated passage. This is as complicated as it gets, really. In fact, by the time you get to verse 14 and 15, we actually have very little idea what in the world Paul's actually talking about. Women will be saved through childbirth, really? So everyone else is saved by having faith in Jesus, but women are saved through childbirth? And it isn't even through childbirth, it is through the birth of the child. So that leads people to speculate, wow, is that a reference to through Jesus, the son of the virgin? But if women are saved through childbirth and men are saved by faith in Jesus Christ, then that just makes a total car crash out of all kinds of theology. Good News Club and Young Life and all that stuff is just, So it's an enormously difficult passage. It's also the centerpiece. It's sometimes for the whole debate. So on the surface, it looks like Paul just flat out says that he doesn't think women either. He doesn't want them either to teach or to preach or to bear authority. And some want to make a distinction between function and office. Can they perform this function but just not have the office? I would like to say, I don't see Paul making that distinction very often. Certainly doesn't in 1 Corinthians. Boy, if you have the gift, you should use it. Pretty clear. So I'm not sure that making the distinction between function and office really solves the problem. So some want to say, well, they can function, they could preach as long as they're under the authority of a male elder. Like they can preach, but they can't preach from behind the pulpit. Or they can preach, but there has to be a man on the platform who can correct her if and when she makes a mistake. Like that's, wow. That's a really thin leash. I don't know how that's a hard one to find in the text. So some scholars, like there's a guy named Tom Schreiner, smart guy, he says that in 1 Timothy, that some say a distinction can be made between office and function, but Schreiner doesn't believe it. I think he's right about that. So he would say women can't be elders or overseers, as he reads 1 Timothy 2, and they shouldn't be teaching or preaching. They just shouldn't be, not to a crowd where there is even one man. Now Schreiner does note that Paul in 1 Timothy 2 is addressing function, not office. Well, then what do you do with 1 Corinthians 11? When the women pray and prophesy. That's Pauline. He says, when they pray and prophesy. He doesn't say, oh my God, I shouldn't have said that. He says, when they pray and prophesy. So the point is for me, the function office distinction doesn't hold water. And then there's the question of office in Paul anyway. Robert Banks is a brilliant Australian New Testament scholar, specialist in the sociology of the New Testament, wrote a really great book with a horrible title, Paul's Idea of Community. Like, he needed a publicist to help him with that one. He and I team taught a class years ago. But a great book pointing out that for Paul, leadership is really a matter of giftedness. And it's the whole church that is to do most of the business of authority. If you read 1 Corinthians, it's just the whole church that is to edify and et cetera. So Banks points out that Paul is primarily concerned with function, not fascinated by office. So it's clear that Paul is dealing with disruptive behavior in worship. It's also clear that he's speaking particularly of wealthy women. The reference in verse 9 to gold, pearls, and expensive clothing makes that abundantly clear. So there's some problem with wealthy women showing off their wealth. And as I pointed out, that was exactly the point of these clubs, these collegia, that you wouldn't join one unless you found one that you had a reasonable chance of rising to the top where you could show off, where you could be the grand poobah for a year. So Paul first deals with male false teachers who were successful in swaying women in the church to their false teaching. That's in the passage just before. And he has an argument about Eve, which seems ad hoc, as he elsewhere commends women teaching. So I'm just pointing out there's that the end of that passage is pretty difficult. And that Paul really wants everybody to learn in submissiveness. He doesn't want women to learn in submissiveness, and men should learn in a rancorous, objectionable way. And the word translated bearing authority is authentane. Now the fancy term is a hapax legomenon, meaning this is the only place it occurs in the Bible. It's not the normal word for authority. So anytime you have a word that occurs only once, you have to say, it's going to be really hard to be clear what exactly it means. And according to the lexical evidence, it most likely means to domineer. So before 300 AD, that word occurs only 3 times in Greek literature. 3. 1 Timothy is one of them. So the other 2 are examples of violence. So one of them, for instance, is used to describe what happened after the Battle of Maronea, where there were people who'd been captured during battle. They were prisoners of war. their weapons were taken from them. And after the battle was over, the victorious side was so worked up that they brought that with their weapons, they came in and they murdered the defenseless prisoners of war. And that's one of the places where that word is used. So to say it means authority almost certainly means something more than just authority. It means some kind of abusive or some kind of dangerous violence. But there's only 3 places you see it. So before 300 AD. So verse 8, Paul wants men to pray without rancor or anger. Now, like, how often do you think about that? Man, those men are praying with anger. They're rancorous in their praying. I mean, that's like having an argument. You know, I want men to pray without anger or rancor. Like, what's going on? What kind of a prayer group is that? You know? So that's, you know, the situation is whatever's going on there, there's a lot that's screwed up. This is not a normal, you know, daily vacation Bible school kind of situation. So it's an ad hoc issue and he's giving a corrective. And he's not necessarily thinking primarily of general instructions to the churches everywhere. I think that's true. He's thinking about a particular situation of disorderly worship. And so who were these men and women? Now some Greek translations under the Greek husband and wife, maybe because of the reference to Adam and Eve later. So it would be, I permit no wife to teach her to have authority over her husband. So see the New Revised Standard Version text here. But what Paul wrote simply can't be limited to husbands and wives. He doesn't actually write husbands and wives. So the Greek syntax leaves open 2 main possibilities. Principally because the main verb pray is missing in the admonition to women and therefore implied in verse 9. So I want the men to pray without rancor, and the women, and there's no verb there. The women dressed modestly. So if it were not that, if it were not praying there and about authority, if it were, I want the women to drive their cars I want the men to drive their cars under the speed limit, and the women safely. We wouldn't turn safely into a verb. Meaning the natural way to read the grammar, if we take out the verbs, then, or if they weren't charged, the natural way to read the grammar is, I want the men everywhere to pray without rancor, and I want the women to pray dressed modestly. Does that make sense? I'm saying that's what the grammar. There's no verb in the clause about the women. There's no primary verb. I think if it were anything else, we would just assume that the same verb applied to what the men were doing is applied to what the women were doing. And then it would be, they should be dressed modestly. Why? Because, like I say, people join these groups to make it about themselves. So if you're going to be up in front praying as a woman, you need to drain what you're doing of any possibility that people will see it as making it about you. And you need to not make it about you. Does that make sense? So other people would disagree with me on that, but that's how I see it, and that's the grammar. I keep doing this when I say grammar. That must be somehow it's. So the parallel for the women is that whatever they are to do should be done dressing modestly. Their dressing modestly is parallel to men being without rancor. So the translation should be, men should pray without rancor, and women should hausautos, likewise also dressing modestly. That's what I just tried to argue. So the options are, is Paul saying women don't pray in public, and instead they're to dress modestly? Or is Paul expecting the reader to understand that women do in fact pray in public, implied by the presence of the word hausautos, also or likewise, in the place where a verb would normally reside? And that while praying, they should be dressed modestly. So I think the second is to be preferred. Since Paul intended option A, the natural way to convey this would be to have to place the verb to dress or being dressed up front, which he doesn't do. Now, it's possible I'm wrong. It's possible that the way other people interpret it, but that's a much steeper hill to climb. The way I've just explained it is the way it would be, what makes the most sense of the grammar, it would be the most natural way to speak. It would be highly unusual to make it appear, to render it the way it's often rendered. Once again, there's no verb, there's no primary verb for what the women are doing. So we would assume they are praying in public, but they are to be doing that dressed modestly. So, two other points to note. The mention of the accoutrements of wealth suggests that the women in question are choosing to use Christian gatherings to make it about themselves. And second, the mention of decency suggests there's something unsavory about the behavior of the women. Are there behavioral echoes of pagan cults, for instance? And because there were cults where women were priestesses, and it could be that was being, there was some confusion there. Once again, Christianity the Romans, the Greeks, anybody who wasn't a Christian, unless you were Jewish, it was just so hard to understand what the Christians were even talking about. 150, 200 years later, there's a report in the Roman records, the Silitan Martyrs, where a Roman judge is interviewing Christians that he's about to condemn, and he says, in exasperation, "We too are a religious people." But the Christians don't see what the Romans are doing as religion. They see it as just, sort of manipulation. There's no personal faith there. There's no living God there with whom they're connected. So verse 10, good deeds are suggested as the alternative to non-decency these women have been exhibiting. I think the whole section is reminiscent of 1 Corinthians, in which several folks had joined the Christian community seeking an arena to display social superiority. Think about 2 Corinthians, which is a really hard letter to figure out what's going on. But it's pretty clear that after Paul had been there, founded the church, and left, some other folks came in, wealthy, wanting to attract attention to themselves, and they're bad-mouthing Paul like crazy. And so it's that kind of thing that he wants people to avoid. It's not about, don't you dare make being in church about you. Don't you dare make praying or teaching, or don't make it about drawing attention to you. The verse begins with quietness, verse 11, and verse 12 ends with quietness. So this is an inclusio. And the contrast to quietness is to reach for and exercise authority over others, and maybe particularly men. Now, neither Jewish culture nor Greek culture permitted women to teach men. But within the world of Roman scruples, this was permissible, but it was not standard, far from standard. And it ought to be remembered that quietness and submission was expected of male students of a rabbi, or of any teacher for that matter. So the word quiet, hesychia, could also be rendered silent, but it carries the nuance of stillness, quiet, rest, paying attention. And the word sigao, which means say nothing, that's the word we saw in the other passage. So this is not shut up, it's be quiet, be attentive. So I'm thinking what's going on here is Paul is saying a woman ought to learn an attitude of proper quietness. Now, to support that, earlier in that very same chapter, Paul uses the word, and in that passage, use it to say that we may live peaceful and quiet lives. So that confirms to me that word means quiet, not silent. Would it make sense for Paul to say, let's live peaceful and totally silent lives? So the word almost certainly means learn in quietness, paying attention. And we get here, be silent then. That's the other passage where it's be silent, sagao, not hesychia. And submission. The question is, submission to what? To men, to their husbands, to the teacher or the speaker, to the message? So Paul says, I do not permit. That's an indicative, meaning he's writing in the present tense. So if you wanted to be really school-marmy about it, you'd say, you might want to translate it as, I do not now permit. So he isn't intentionally trying to say for all time. He might mean that, but he's not intentionally saying that. It's not a command. It's in the indicative. If you were intending a permanent command, you might expect him to say, do not permit a woman to teach. Instead, he writes, I'm not now permitting, or something like that you could render it that way. So I'm not saying it can't be taken as a permanent command, but merely to point out that if Paul wanted it to be taken, but if he wanted it to be taken permanently, he could have made it explicit. But he doesn't. Is that making sense? If he wanted it to be a permanent command, he could have made it. He could have done that, but instead he chose the indicative. And there's a great deal of debate over authenteo. If Paul wanted to say authority, one would have expected him to choose the word exousiazo, exousia. He does not. Of course, it might just be. It's possible there's just semantic variety. You know, many of you have probably heard about the three loves, right? Agape, phileo, eros, and that's great, except it doesn't actually work that way. Now, those three ideas of love are there, but in John's Gospel, for instance, agapao and phileo are used interchangeably. So that is the ideas of self-giving love and brotherly love and the difference between them. Those ideas, those are true, those are real, but they depend on context more than narrow definitions of verbs. So there are places, like at the very end, Simon, son of John, do you love me, etc., where it's phileo, agapao. Those words in the way we traditionally understand, so their meaning, it makes sense. But if you look elsewhere in John's Gospel, Jesus particularly can use phileo and agapao interchangeably. So once again, words aren't quite like dollar bills, 5, 10, 50. They can change their currency a little bit. We have to depend not just on dictionary definition, but also on context. So perhaps we shouldn't make too much of this word. But then again, authenteo is an extremely rare word. As I said, it occurs only 3 times before 300. And this is the only time in the New Testament. And what about the teaching? Is Paul saying that women cannot teach? Now, in most of the New Testament, teaching is a function. It's a spiritual gift as much as it is an office. And according to Paul, Colossians 3, as well as Hebrews 5:12, it's something that every believer was called to do, at least now and then. And then there's also the assumption that authority rests in the teacher, right? So I think I was introduced as Dr. Nystrom, then the idea is I know what I'm talking about, right? Maybe I got my doctorate from, Captain Crunch University or something, but we place authority in the teacher. In the Bible, in that culture, the authority is more often placed in the teaching, not in the teacher. Now, there are certainly teachers that are respected, so I'm not saying they didn't respect teachers, but what they do is they actually pay attention then to the teaching and weigh the teaching. Does the teaching have authority? In the New Testament, authority lies in the deposit of truth, in the faith passed along. And teaching is subject to evaluation, just like any other ministry role, from the very same book, 1 Timothy. And Timothy was urged to rebuke anyone departing from the sound instruction of our Lord Jesus Christ. So even if they were a famous teacher, if they wander from the sound instruction, they were to be rebuked. And I permit no woman to teach or bear authority. So the word translated teach is the usual term, didaskalos or didaskein is the verb. But have authority, as I said, is, it's a verbal noun. That is an infinitive. And it occurs only 3 times before 300 AD. And it means to commit an act of violence, to take matters into one's own hand, to exercise mastery over, to hold sway over someone or something. So the historian Diodorus used the term of someone who'd robbed a sacred shrine, and they said that Polybius describes the massacre at Maronea. So the range of meaning isn't just authority, but it's domination and intentional abuse, intentional damage. And computer-aided searches of vast databases unavailable to previous generations made it clear that this word is about violence and has little to do with authority, more broadly speaking. Someone who does violence is claiming some kind of authority, but it's not authority in general. It is only centuries later that folks began to use this term to convey authority. And there are all kinds of New Testament scholars who will say, no, it just means authority. I think they're wrong. And I think I'm right in thinking they're wrong. Yeah, Al Mohler, smart guy, bright guy, he thinks it means, it can be used of rulers in the Gentile world. Yeah, that's true, but what does Jesus say about rulers? Well, you know how the rulers of the Gentiles really take care of their subjects and have more affection for their subjects than they do for themselves. He says, no, you know how the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. So just to say it's used of rulers generally doesn't take away the point that it's about doing violence. And the word originally means, this is in Attic Greek, so that's Attic. That's the Attic Peninsula where Athens was. So there are various dialects of ancient Greek. So in Attic Greek, it means kin murderer. That's an interesting idea. Cousin murderer. So that's clearly not, that's violence. And it carries the idea of like someone you trust ends up murdering you from behind, stabbing you in the back. So that's clear violence. The wisdom of Solomon, so this is the Septuagint, used it to describe parents who've killed their own children. So it's not just, that's a kind of authority. Do parents have authority over kids? Yes, they do. Do parents who kill their kids have authority over them? Yeah, but that's really kind of twisted use of that authority. So it's not just general authority, almost certainly. I'm going to say there's no way it means the same thing as just simple authority, like exousia is the usual Greek word just for authority. Prison guards have authority, but the range of intended meaning, the licit connotative meanings, when we speak of authority of prison guards, is quite different than the authority of kindergarten teachers. Do prison guards have the authority to physically threaten prisoners? Yes, they do. Now, when I was in kindergarten teachers did have the authority to threaten children, but I don't think they do anymore. I was personally threatened, and deservedly so. Because people who were masters in the culture did indeed domineer. That was the point. That'd be normal. Jesus, those in authority over them call themselves benefactors, but they lord it over them. So why does Paul say this? Well, maybe this passage is in line with the others that suggest male headship and leadership are God's design. I don't think that's true, but a lot of people do. A second possibility is the kingdom of God and this world dynamic, meaning the kingdom of God is breaking into this world. And the kingdom of God has a certain ethic. But this world has a different ethic. And where those two meet, then sometimes you have to compromise, for a greater purpose, you need to sacrifice a secondary concern to achieve a primary goal. So Paul will say, I'll do whatever it takes to win people to Christ. So the rich, the poor, to preach, I'll do whatever it takes. Now, in other contexts, some of those secondary matters are really important to him, right? He's very concerned that people respect his authority. But in other places he says, are they making fun of me? Yeah, it's okay, because they're preaching Christ. So he is concerned about people respecting his authority, but that's not a number one concern for him. And then there's the grammatical dynamic, the uk, ugda, neither nor. That's a poetic device which sets in parallel groupings of words in a variety of ways. And this is a device that's not uncommon in the Bible. So, I permit no woman to teach nor to bear authority. See, those two words are paired. I permit no woman to teach nor to bear authority. So how do we understand this? So there are several ways to pair synonyms. Neither despised nor scorned. Flip them. Neither scorned nor despised. Change the meaning? Not at all. To pair antonyms. Neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free. Does that fit? No, not really. They're not antonyms. To pair related ideas. Neither of the night nor of the dark. 1 Thessalonians 5:5. They're not really related ideas. To move from the general to the particular. The wisdom of this age nor the rulers of this age. To define a natural progression, they neither sow nor reap. To define a purpose or a goal, where thieves neither break in nor destroy, right? Lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, not treasures on earth, because if you lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, that's where thieves can neither break in nor destroy. Why do thieves break in? Do thieves break in to say, oh, I love what they've done with the place? Isn't this carpet divine? Let's clean up before we leave. Thieves break in to destroy. They break in to steal. So the point of the first action is to accomplish the second. So in the passage that we're talking about, only two of these possibilities make sense. Either they pair synonyms, neither despised nor scorned. I permit no woman to teach or bear authority. I permit no woman to bear authority or to teach. That's one possibility. The other is the point of the first is to accomplish the second. I permit no woman to teach if her aim in doing so is to, and then it's not bear authority, it's authentating, to domineer. Now, if you ask me, that makes a lot of sense. What's he already said about the women? These are women who are showing up and they're wearing their best clothes and they're saying, look, we're better than the rest of you. Is that making sense? That makes this whole passage have cogency, if you ask me. And that's totally legitimate grammatically. Now, I think that's what I said. I think it makes the most sense of this passage, but there are lots of folks who don't agree with me on this. So the six possibilities, only two fit the passage. Are they synonyms, or is it teleological? And the last option, I think, fits 1 Timothy 2 as grammatically illicit. The point of breaking in is to steal. So why are they domineering? They're teaching with the aim of domineering. They're saying, we're better than you. So I'm going to say Paul is not against women teaching. He's about women, he's about anybody abusing the authority they have in teaching in a Christian context. Don't you dare make it about you. And that's clearly what they're doing. The fine clothes makes that unmistakable. Now, like I say, there are other people who disagree with me, but I think they're wrong. This to me makes the most sense of the passage. And what we know about the rest of the passage even. It's a vexed situation. Men are praying, I want men to pray without rancor. I've never been in a situation where men are praying with rancor. So there's clearly a lot of tension and disunity and anger in this mix. So that's another reason why I think this makes most sense in the middle of because he's talking about a vexed situation. Adam was formed first and then Eve. Okay, that's really difficult. Is the issue in 1 Timothy insubordination? A lot of people think so. A lot that have the traditional view of male headship. And if so, what is the referent? What convention is being thwarted? The men are praying in anger and in strife, and the women are flaunting their wealth and are not learning in submission to authority. That's according to one model. Well, why is what the men doing any better? how is this perhaps what the women are doing wrong subverting the situation? The men don't need any help to screw it up. They're doing it all by themselves. So is it insubordination of women to men? Some people want to draw the parallel to Genesis 3, and they see Eve's sin as not following the lead of her husband. That is, she was being insubordinate to him. A lot of people argue that. I'd like to know where that's in the text. Go home, read Genesis 3, and see if you see Eve being insubordinate, or the text even making that point. I don't see Genesis making that point, that she's being insubordinate by responding to the serpent. But a lot of people argue that. I just don't see it. And the formula first then, protos eta, is assumed to convey authority. That's what people argue, because that's here. So the men must have authority. But in the very next chapter, 10 verses later actually, Paul uses that same formula to define a series of events, when he says deacons must first be tested and then let them serve. So folks want to make it about authority in chapter 2, but want to make it about a series of events in chapter 3. I don't know if you get to do that. Are you following me there? It's some pretty complicated Greek grammar, or just grammar. So I'm going to say, to see the point is Eve not following the lead of her husband over is to place within the Genesis record that which is not there. Some further say Adam was involved that he did not exercise his role as male leader, thus leading to a vacuum Eve felt compelled to fill. Well, if that's what the text is trying to say, why doesn't it say that? I just don't see that very elaborate set of conclusions in the Genesis text. The point of Genesis 3 seems to be about deception. Satan lies about what God has said, rather than about the insubordination of Eve. And you might remember, it's not until after all this happens that God says, okay, here's the way it's going to be now. Your husband will rule over you. That's after the fall. That's not the situation that pertained, apparently, when Eve was being tempted by Satan. So to me, that's a type of argument that just works a little bit too hard. I don't think the evidence can support it. What about other Pauline passages? In 1 Corinthians 11:8, Paul says, man did not come from a woman, but woman from man. He then quickly adds, but they come from each other. 2 Corinthians 11:3, Paul says, I am afraid that just as Eve was deceived by the serpent's cunning, your minds may somehow be led astray from your sincere and pure devotion to Christ. But here, Eve stands not for women, but for everybody. She stands for the whole human family, men as well as women. All humanity are easily deceived. So it just makes it, I think it makes it hard. All this makes it hard to sustain the traditional understanding of this passage. So once again, I think what it's saying is, I permit no woman to teach if her aim in doing so is to make it about herself. That's congruent with everything else he said in the passage. And women will be saved through childbearing. This is up there. I mean, if there are like 10, I really don't have any idea what that's about, passages in Scripture, this is one of them. So what does he mean? That women will be saved, whatever that means, by childbirth? So Really? Men are saved through faith in Jesus and women are saved by childbirth? What about women who never bear children? So if that's what he means, we have to radically rethink what Paul thinks the death and resurrection of Christ accomplishes. Saved can mean rescued from danger or released. The term soter was, before Christianity, almost purely a political term. That's where it comes from, savior. If someone, a general was victorious in a battle, then they were especially if it was unexpected, they're the savior. And it was, so some translate this as healed. And it is translated that way in a lot of places in the Gospels. Matthew 9, 21, 22. Normally, but not always in Paul, saved is from sin and judgment. So is a woman saved on the basis of works? Such a view hardly comports with Paul's theology. Perhaps the key phrase is dia tes teknogonios. Does it mean through the childbirth, that is the ordeal of childbirth? Does it mean through the means of childbirth, that is through the idea of it, through works? Does it mean through both the ordeal of childbirth and the fact of having children? Or does it mean through the childbirth, meaning through Jesus? Meaning we ought to remember that the Savior of the world was born of a woman. Didn't just appear. God just didn't make him appear. He didn't just get in the transporter room of the Starship Enterprise and beam down, fully. So maybe that's what Paul is trying to convey. And we ought to maybe note the parallel of 1 Timothy 2 with Genesis 3. And both mention is made of Adam formed first. Both next mention that Eve was deceived and sinned. 1 Timothy says that the woman will be saved through childbirth. Genesis says that the offspring of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. So there's some justification in thinking Paul has in mind that idea from Genesis when he's writing 1 Timothy. So, as I said, a lot of people want to say Eve is deceived in taking the lead in the male-female relationship. The text pretty much makes it clear Eve is deceived into disobeying the command of God. Adam was formed first, then Eve. A lot of people want to say, well, therefore Adam's superior. Paul knows full well that chronological order doesn't necessarily imply superiority, right? Right? Who's older, Esau or Jacob? Who's older? who's older, Isaac or Ishmael? Right? Is David the oldest son of Jesse? So order in the Bible doesn't necessarily imply superiority. So why does he say Adam formed first and then Eve? Is he saying, look, if you want women to be superior, don't you know it goes against creation? Or is he saying, as in the question of gifts as supposed markers of spiritual maturity, is he playing with their argument only to show its idiocy? Is he saying, your argument is that a male headship? Well, really? All that to say, I think there's plenty of reason to read 1 Timothy 2 as when the women pray and prophesy, they should do so with their heads covered, number one. And so they should pray and prophesy. And that to do otherwise would be to be drawing attention to themselves. So I don't see this passage as supporting some sort of female subordination. Does that make sense? Okay. So I think we're done for tonight in terms of the unpacking the text. We'll finish up with unpacking the text next week, and then we'll also have more question and answer. But now it is time for Q&A, I think. Is that right, Irene?
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, raise your hand, and then we'll have someone run a mic to you. Thanks, Jackie.
My question is on the last bullet point. So when it says he's playing with their argument, can you expound on that? Is it the fact that the women are trying to be seen as most important, or what do you mean by that statement, he is playing with their argument?
So it's possible. I don't think this is what he's actually doing, but it's possible that he's saying this about women just to make the argument seem really ridiculous. To say, well, Adam was formed first, so therefore that he's superior, but he's not. But he isn't granted a superior status. That's my point. Maybe not a major point. But all this was just exploring other possibilities that have been put forward. So I don't think that actually holds water.
So when the women, how the church was set up, I thought women were separate from men when in the churches back then. Was it everyone all together, or were they separate?
Yeah, so clearly they were not separate, because the women are supposed to ask their husbands at home. If they were separate, they wouldn't be able to ask their husbands during the service. Now that is really that's remarkable. I mean, what we believe we know for sure is that in Judaism, women were not instructed. So that makes what's going on in the Jesus menagerie really unusual. There are women right there who are actually present while he's teaching. That we know of no other rabbi for whom that's the case. So that's really remarkable. And and the other thing that I think, I don't know if I've made this point yet, but social distinctions mattered in this world. So maybe I did make this point last week. So if you were a slave and had been set free, you would never be a free person. You'd always be a freed person. Now, what we know outside the New Testament, so maybe I mentioned this last week too. Did I mention about Pliny being sent by Trajan to Asia Minor? No. So Pliny the Younger was the agent of the emperor Trajan, a good emperor, who sent him to Asia Minor, to Bithynia. That's the northern coast of Turkey, at the south end of the Black Sea, to investigate fiscal mismanagement. And anyway, while he's there, he encounters Christians. He'd never heard of them before, and he interviews a bunch of them, executes some, writes back, yeah, so I killed them. And but he talks about he met two slave women, who describe what goes on in a Christian service, and he calls them, this is in Latin, he calls them ministere, minister. Now we don't know what that means for him, whether it means they're the senior pastor. With a parking space designated near the door. We don't know, but whatever it is, they have an official position. And I don't think there is a parallel anywhere in the Roman society to a voluntary association that brought people from different places in the Roman social hierarchy, and that slaves would be in a position of any kind of authority. I don't think there's another example outside early Christianity where that's the case. So there are hints of it in the New Testament, but here's something outside the New Testament, written by someone who's not a Christian but reporting on it. So that tells me that this ethic, this radical egalitarian ethic, really had force. We may have actually lost a lot of that, in our culture.
So, I'm sorry, I was taking and it's at 1 Corinthians?
No, yeah, 1 Corinthians 34.
1 Corinthians, we were in 1 Corinthians 14, 34, and it said that that they are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says.
Yeah.
Can you expound on what he's referring to there?
Yeah, you mean what law he's talking about?
Yeah.
I don't know.
The RSV said capitalize it. NIV doesn't.
Yeah,
Sorry,
well, they
RSV
don't. Yeah,
capitalized it, but not
yeah, and
NIV.
they shouldn't capitalize it.
So we
So-
don't know what he's referring to as in the law. You
So
know,
we,
there's
so
supposed
we
to be a
don't know
submission
we
as
don't
in
know
the
exactly
law.
what it is. Now, if it's law, so remember what is a submission? It's not that they shouldn't talk, but that they're disrupting the service. They're disrupting the teaching. So Paul wants them to learn. He tells that elsewhere, but don't be disruptive during this. We would say the sermon. So as the law says, what law is that? It could be anything. It could be just even the general idea that the word should be listened to and paid attention to. It might be as simple as that. So I don't. It's clearly some law he has in mind, but it might be just the general idea, or it might be something specific. And once again, we are. Most of Paul's letters he's responding to something people have written him. So they're like listening to a phone conversation, right? Like if my phone rang right now, I said, "Excuse me, hi, yeah, oh, hi, yeah, yeah, I'll be home soon, yeah, love you too, right? Yeah, okay, bye." So who am I talking to? My wife, yeah. If I said no, my mom, then you're thinking, okay. Okay. So I mean, right? Because we don't have the letter they wrote. A lot of it depends on what we imagine the question was, and so we need a little more humility about, because there are places where he's really clear about the question, but others where he's not so clear. So it seems to me the basic law is, wow, the word, we need to pay attention to it. It's being expounded, don't disrupt the service.
So does that mean it's the men's world at that time? They could interrupt the session?
No, I
and
think
not women?
nobody could really. Although, as I said, maybe I said this, but we have a number of Augustine sermons, and there it was really tough. I mean, he had a hostile crowd all the time. So we know a lot about even the back and forth between Augustine and the people in his parish or his church. But that was, he died in 430 AD, so that's a couple hundred years later. So, but it was, you were supposed to be respectful. In Judaism, you'd be respectful.
So, as a follow-up to that question, does that mean that men didn't interrupt? Or did Paul just not mention that?
Well, so once again, the word is be quiet, be silent. And that is don't. So when the word is being expounded, that's not a time to make it about you, but either by asking questions or just being too loud or whatever. So it's about, he would have said the same thing to men if they happen to be the ones talking. But the women are asking questions. Why? Well, if they have any background in Judaism, I mean, women weren't educated beyond what they could pick up. And but we don't know enough about the social context. But the basic idea is not women should never speak. It's that they're asking questions and it's disrupting what the main thrust of the service.
That was actually my question.
So is it they needed to play catch up, and maybe that the catch up so that they could catch up with what the men had been learning in the Jewish schools all along, do it at home?
It's possible that has something to do with it. I'm not sure that's what's really going on. In large part because this is probably by now it's a polyglot community. There's Jewish people there, but there's also Gentiles, and as I said, paganism has nothing to do with sin or redemption. Paganism is a series of cult acts. And if something's gone wrong in your life, then you've angered some god. Just figure out which one and placate them. Give them a toy, spill a little wine, and then you're good. So there's no morality in paganism. And that could be just hugely like, well, what? I mean, it would be just crazy for if you were a pagan who comes to faith and you start going to a Christian service. It would just look so much about it would be completely foreign. Not just the form, but the purpose. This is not, I mean, not religion as they understand it. So there's nothing about morality or moral development or even sin. Sin is error. There's no sin in paganism. You've accidentally upset some god, some all-powerful teenager, and now you've got to calm him down or her down.
In a book called The Biblical Making of Womanhood by Beth Allison Barr, I think it is, she talks about how the interpretation of these scriptures have kind of changed throughout Christian church history. Do you find the same thing in your background, that depending on whether it was the Middle Ages or when Protestantism, I can't say that word, came about, that these definitions began to change and morph?
So it's actually probably much earlier than that. So what we see in the New Testament is we have situations, and we'll talk about this one next week, but Phoebe is the deacon, or something called the deaconess of Kencre, and she's the one who brings the letter to Rome, to the church in Rome. And then there's also Andronicus and Junia, who are well-known, famous among the apostles. So there's a lot of work done to try to make Phoebe not a real apostle, or maybe we've misunderstood Phoebe's name, and there's a lot of work done to turn Andronicus and Junia, either Junia into a man, or maybe they're not really true apostles. So those are two passages we'll talk about next week. But I think what we do know is by the time you get to maybe even 150, 200, there are really no women in leadership that we hear about in church history.